Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, this is about Ruth, by the way. Let's start it over and say this. One day, Naomi, Ruth's mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, should I not try to find a home for you where you will be well provided for? Is not Boaz, with whose servant girls you have been, a kinsman of ours? Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash and perfume yourself and put on your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do." "I will do whatever you say," Ruth answered.
So I bet a lot of people can relate to this, but my mom was really horribly impatient about wanting me to settle down and get married. You ever had that kind of experience? Even though she was married 3 times and had some really horrible relationships, she fancied herself a matchmaker. And it seemed that every eligible woman that she met, she would try to introduce me to, and it seemed to her like I was perfect for everyone, and everyone was perfect for me, and all I needed was just the right shove, at just the right time, and her dream of having grandbabies would be one step closer to being fulfilled. The problem was I didn't really like to be pushed, and I just feel like my mom had just babies on the brain, that maybe she went through a lot of her life with that "matchmaker, matchmaker, make me a match" song just stuck in her head, for years. So it put me in some pretty awkward situations. And as we restart our series through Ruth and after Pentecost and pick up where we left off, there's been kind of a major shift in the book of Ruth from Naomi being the main character now to Ruth, who the book is named after, being the main character. And to catch us up to where we are in the story, Naomi and her foreign-born daughter-in-law have recently returned to Jerusalem as widows. And without husbands, they're really economically vulnerable. And they're forced to glean from fields, pick up from scraps from the corner of the field to get their food. And in fact, they were really lucky that they had the opportunity even to pick up scraps at the corner of the field, because it was harvest time and they had laws that protected the poor and the disenfranchised, but those laws only really came into effect during certain times of the year. And so this is one of them. And if it wasn't for that, their situation would be really grim. Ruth happens to end up at the field of a wealthy man named Boaz, who happens to be a distant relative of Naomi, and he's radically generous to her. In fact, he doesn't just make her glean from the corners of the field, he actually lets her pick right from the stuff that's been freshly harvested. And he sends her home with a whole lot more food than he should have, and kind of uses these laws as an excuse to be ridiculously generous. But still, they have this situation looming. They're worried about what's going to happen for the rest of their lives. What's going to happen after the barley season's over? And so it's only a temporary relief from a really big problem that they have. And so Naomi, seeking to secure more of a stable future for her new daughter, instructs her here to do something really bold. She tells Ruth to wash up and put her best foot forward, to sneak over to where Boaz is camped at the community grain processing area, and to get his attention. And this is a really risky sort of move. It breaks a lot of social conventions. But it's maybe just the shove that Ruth and Boaz need to make a little bit, to step a little bit closer down that road to happily ever after, And so, relationships are messy. They're messy now, and they were messy back then. And they're a risky business, So even though our social circumstances are a whole lot different than they were in the time of Ruth, it doesn't make the challenges of being in a relationship any easier. And perhaps one of the biggest differences between marriage back then and marriage now is that it wasn't simply an agreement between two individuals like we think about marriage. It was a decision to join two families together. And as I hinted earlier, many of us wouldn't really be comfortable with the idea of someone else arranging our marriage for us. It just seems so strange. We have this ideal that marriage should be based on love, and that we should be free to choose who we're married to, and that we are really the ultimate arbiters of our destiny when it comes to our love life. And many of us, having parents who grew up in the 60s or after the fallout from the 60s sexual revolution, would have a hard time trusting our parents to pick for us. My mom's been married 3 times. And many of us know that brokenness that comes from kind of having that laissez-faire attitude to love that happened in our time. And so marriage has changed a whole lot in the last 150 years. It used to be not primarily about love or our feelings, but really about survival. And so men needed an heir, and women needed a stable environment to produce children in. And so often we would have what we'd be really uncomfortable with would be a very older man and a very teenage girl maybe getting married. But that was just the way of the world. And so this is a little bit different situation than that, but it's really easy for us, I think, to kind of look down our noses at these old ancient love stories and these stories from the Bible and how it was back then, and kind of impose our modern, biases about marriage. And so we don't like this idea that love would be maybe the dessert and not really the main course of a marriage. And we don't like that these two women couldn't just farm their own land by themselves and without the help of any man support themselves and just do everything, everything that they could. We don't like the idea of women being not as empowered back then as they are today. But the economic forces were different. The whole society was based on the strength of a male back. It was based on working a lot of land. Everything was done by hand. So it wasn't like she could just get a job down at the local Walmart or something and find a small apartment and get by. It just wasn't the situation. And so there was no such thing as mechanized farming. There was no such thing as chemical fertilizers. There's no such thing as pesticides. Everything had to be done by hand. And so that was just the way that the world worked. And so as we project our modern biases back on time onto this story, we should do so with a little bit of humility. 50% of marriages in our time fail. 50%. So before we judge them for what they did and think that they had everything wrong, we should kind of look at what we're replacing it with. Take an honest look at that. And so making marriage primarily about our idealistic notions of love has really set marriage on some pretty shaky ground. If we're honest, we'll realize that. So, and if you think the idea of arranged marriages is completely crazy and something that we can't even relate to on any level, I just want to challenge you to think about computer dating. It's just a modern incarnation of the arranged marriage. We give people our information, and whether it's a computer algorithm or just an objective person or somebody that we love, it's the same thing. It's exactly the same thing. Somebody puts us together, and I think we would do well maybe to have a sort of objective, look at that. Often when we jump into a relationship, we don't really think it through or think about objectively about if we're really a good fit or not. And often that can get us in trouble. And so in Hebrew culture, a newly married person or a newly married man wasn't just somebody who would set off on their own, go get a place to live on their own like we do today. They would often have a little nook, in their father's house. And then they would stay on that same land that they lived on. And someday their father would die and they would take over or whatever. And so it was really the father who was the person who chose a bride, a husband and bride together. The fathers were the ones that did the matchmaking back in the day. And so as economic value was lost, as a woman was kind of moved from her family and joined to the father, the husband's family, there was an economic loss that happened as part of the farm. And so it's easy to look back at what they did and think of this as kind of like buying a wife, as if wives were like property, and it can seem like that at times. But really this was just providing a way for marriage to be possible. Because as they took away the help and all that from a family, it could limit that family's ability to produce food and jeopardize that family's future. And so Naomi inherits this job of matchmaker. She, in a further break from social conventions, rather than just going to Boaz herself and asking her, "What do you think about marrying Ruth?" She comes up with this bold plan that, so it's a calculated move here to get Boaz's attention. And we already know from the story that Boaz had noticed Ruth, that he had a great deal of respect for Ruth, that he cared for her enough to commit these acts of radical generosity all along the story. But this wouldn't be enough to save Ruth and Naomi from their economic situation that would eventually catch up to them. Eventually the barley harvest would be over and they would run out of food and either starve to death, sell themselves into slavery to survive, or resort to prostitution. I mean, that's basically the only three options for a disenfranchised woman in between these different harvests. And so what was needed was something more like a covenant, more like a relationship. What was needed really was a marriage. And so here we find Naomi conspiring, if you will, for love. Conspiring with her daughter to kickstart this thing and get it moving in the right direction. When we think about humility, we don't think about boldness being a part of that humility. We think of them as being opposites. And at times, though, humility can call us to bold action. As Christians, we believe that God knows what we need even before we ask Him. Yet, when it comes to asking for help, many of us are too proud to do it, to actually open up our mouths and speak. And this is something that I'm really painfully aware of. It doesn't look like I have a broken arm, but I do. My arm's still broken, and there's things that I can't do. And I have to ask for a lot of help, and it's hard. Every time it's hard, because there's something in me that doesn't want to ask for help, that wants to take care of everything on my own. And it calls me to humility to ask, to watch my wife pull Greta out of the car seat of the car because I can't do it, or I can't start the lawnmower. I can't. That would be too dangerous for the healing process. It wouldn't be worth the pain, and it wouldn't be worth what it would do to my arm. And so I don't want to be a burden to people, but I have to ask people. I have to be bold enough to open my mouth. And so it's hard to acknowledge our limitations, and at times we just have to ask for help. And love is one of those things that provides the circumstances for us to ask for help. Love is something that can only be experienced in a community. And when we become vulnerable and ask for help, it puts us in a risky place. A place where we're at the mercy of others, where we can experience rejection. And just as we have to experience the mercy of others, just as Ruth and Naomi did. And it's a scary thing. It was scary then and it's scary now. But when we're in need and have an opportunity to ask to have that need met, it's not the time for pride. It's not the time to take a passive stance and sit around waiting for someone to notice. We just have to own up to it. Be humble and bold. We have to strike when the iron's hot and not miss that moment when it comes along. On Netflix, there's this documentary about David Geffen, who's a big name in the 90s. He started a label in the 90s called Geffen Records, which is a major label. And it's hard to watch a movie about David Geffen's life without feeling like a total failure. I mean, he accomplished so much at such a young age. So by the time he was 30, he was palling around with rock stars and movie stars and was a huge name. But when he was trying to get his foot in the door of the music industry, he lied. He lied and said that he went to NYU on his resume. He got hired at a company called Tower Records. And as most people who get hired at a company like Tower Records, they had to start out in the mailroom. And so it wasn't just like you'd be in the mailroom forever necessarily, but that was the only place that a new person could really come in and maybe work their way up to a place where you could be a music producer. And so when David Geffen started working in the mailroom, he made a quick friend of this guy who'd also lied about going to NYU. And one day he came into work, and he was a really talented guy, and they just hit it off. But one day he came to work, and his friend wasn't there, and he come to find out that his friend had been fired because they got a letter from NYU saying they didn't know who this guy was at all, And so David Geffen knew that the same exact thing would happen to him. And so every day in the mailroom after work, he would wait around, he would dig through every single piece of mail for months to find that letter that was going to come for him, that was going to get him fired. And when that letter finally came, he found it and he ripped it up and he threw it away. And when that opportunity came to be a music producer, David Geffen rose, like no other. But he would have completely missed his opportunity if that letter had gone through. I'm not trying to advocate deceit, I'm not trying to advocate doing whatever it takes to live your dream necessarily. But in David Geffen's story, there's more than that going on. His story reminds us that it takes patience and boldness to get what we really want or what we really need. And sometimes there is a definitive moment that comes along in our lives that requires great courage, and if we don't rise to the occasion, we'll miss that moment and it'll pass us by. In life, there are moments that if we don't act, we'll never get a second chance. And for Ruth and Naomi, this is exactly what this was. And so something radical was needed, and Naomi was asking Ruth to do something really radical indeed. And how does Ruth respond to this incredulous request from her mother-in-law? She simply says, "I'll do whatever you say." You or I might not have been so trusting, or so quick to just risk everything in this bold move. Uncovering a man's feet in that culture is a strange custom to us, but it's something that actually still lives on today in the Middle East. In certain cultures, there's still a situation like this that would require a kinsman redeemer, or goel in Hebrew. And it's not a sexual thing, it's not a seductive gesture as we might read into the story. And so we're going to look a whole lot more at that next week, but it was actually a customary way for someone to ask the help of a kinsman redeemer. And so it was a way out of a tragic situation. It was really the only path that you could take. And so for a woman in this scenario, she was asking a man for help, and he could say no by covering his feet back up, and the woman would take the hint and go away. Or he could cover her over with his blanket, symbolizing that he was going to take her in under his wing, so to speak. And so there was no place for argument or justification. The whole thing could happen in total silence. They knew what it was. Ruth maybe didn't know what it was because she was from a different place and a different culture, and Naomi had to tell her exactly what to do. But there wasn't a place for argument. There was a lot of risk involved in this. And so Ruth was an outsider. She wasn't a Jewish woman. She was a Moabite. She was part of a people that weren't exactly much loved by the Jewish people. And so Boaz could have said no, and no one would have questioned his judgment in this way. Their situation was so tragic, really, and so unique that there wasn't really a law for every situation. It's almost just everyone has been widowed. This is really common. There's a foreign-born daughter-in-law in the equation. There was no law for this. And so Boaz could have just said, no, that's okay. I don't want to be your kinsman redeemer. It would have been really easy to do. And so there was a lot of risk involved. If Boaz was offended at her basically proposing to him, he could have meant the end of his generosity, which was really the only thing that was keeping them afloat. He could just write her off as a gold digger. And if she was caught trying to make her way to or from the sleeping man's bed at night, it wouldn't exactly look good. It could tarnish both of their reputations. And as an outsider or a foreigner, she could get shunned by the whole town, or kicked down the road, or even stoned to death for somebody thinking that she was an adulteress or a fornicator. Remember, she's doing this in a public place. This grain processing area is a public place. They did a lot of civic things there. They had judgments and meetings, town hall meeting type things there. It wasn't just any old place. This was a public place. And so there were people sleeping, guarding their piles of grain to make sure that no one comes and steal it. And so there's not just Boaz and his men probably here. This is maybe lots of people. And so she's sneaking into this area to do this really risky thing in a very public place. And so Ruth trusts her mother-in-law's advice and follows this crazy plan. She humbly accepts this push to bold action and demonstrates humility and obedience and really does the unexpected. In Jesus' parables, we find the same sort of thing. The kingdom of God is taught about as something that requires bold action to acquire. Some people even, like in the parable of the pearl of the great price, somebody would sell everything that they have to buy this field that's worth a whole lot more. And so it's something that requires us to risk it all. And in Ruth, we see this same sort of courage and dedication, and the same sort of defining moment coming along. And while she's looking to her immediate needs, there's something that mirrors in physical terms the exact same redemptive pattern that we find in the New Testament. Zacchaeus climbed a tree. Levi walked away from his tax booth. Peter and James walked away from their nets. They all took a risk that would change their lives forever. And so we don't want to minimize that same exact thing that this heroine is doing. They all trusted that God would meet their needs if they reached out in faith and did something that might be perceived as a little bit crazy. And so my question for us today is where do we have need? Perhaps a lot of us are more like Boaz in this story. Perhaps we're safe and secure, somewhat generous, but not necessarily looking for any big life-changing commitments right now. Caught up in the daily grind of just going to work and the responsibilities that we find in regular life. The chances are some of us are actually people here like Ruth. Maybe finding ourselves in a desperate situation, maybe not quite sure how to ask for help. It takes a lot of courage to be vulnerable. It takes humility and boldness to get to the other side of the needs that we have, whether those needs are physical needs or spiritual needs. But as the old adage reminds us, it's the squeaky wheel that gets the grease. God knows what we need even before we ask Him, and often the way that He meets those needs is through us, through God's people, through normal, obedient people just like us who are filled with God's love and who have both motive and opportunity. And so as we go into this time of open worship, I invite you to do something completely crazy. Vocalize your need. Trust that if you do something crazy like be vulnerable and open and bold, that you just might get to the other side of that need. So I invite you to stand and humble yourself, and as the Spirit leads, make known any unmet needs that you have in your life. And perhaps people will feel equally led to meet those needs. if they're made known. In James it says that we have not because we ask not. And so I want you, as we go into this time of open worship, I want you to think about your need. And if you feel led by God, stand and just ask. And if you're new with us today, we're in a posture here together of listening to God, and there's a pamphlet here in the pew pocket in front of you about what we're trying to do. But listen to God, be attentive to God's Spirit, and as you feel moved, act. And if you would please stand and wait for a microphone to be brought to you. There are a lot of people who are hard of hearing and will need to be able to hear what it is that you're saying. And so please wait. Be bold, but don't be so bold that you're